to our parallelism module. We've introduced Flynn's taxonomy of parallel architectures. And we said that we are interested in SIMD and MIMD architectures. SIMD stands for single instruction, multiple data. MIMD is multiple instructions, multiple data. What we are going to do now, we will take a bit of a dive into some of the SIMD architectures. We're not going to actually build a SIMD architecture, but we'll see how does a programmer see it. So let's get into that. So our SIMD architectures are there to exploit data level parallelism. So we would like to fetch one instruction and apply it to multiple sets of data. Typically, if it is an addition, we would just fetch one add, that would be some sort of a vector add, and apply it to all of the elements of two vectors. So instead of a scalar add, where we would be just adding two scalar operands, this time we would be doing vector addition of element by element for both of the vectors. Same thing applies to, say, multiplication, and we can, in this example here, we can simply multiply a coefficient vector by a data vector such that we can perhaps perform some kind of filtering. In the next step, we would just add those results. So why is this faster? Well, because we just need to fetch one instruction instead of every time fetching the same instruction. So if we are operating on a vector, we would fetch one instruction and apply it to multiple data pairs. Now you may say, well, but I'm going to be bottlenecked by the data. No, if the bandwidth for getting all of that data is wide enough, such that we can get chunks of data, say from the memory, or more likely from the cache. People have noticed this, and there has been always, or for a long time, there has been interest in vector architectures or these kinds of SIMD extensions. The first noted SIMD machine was implemented by MIT Lincoln Labs. That was the TX2 in 1957. And if you look at it, they had an ability to run their full 36-bit data, or they could split it into two 17-bit operands, or split it further into 9-bit operands. They were not quite working with standardized bytes and words back then, or actually the word here was 35 bits. These architectures were around for a while, but were seen in a wide commercial use when they were introduced by Intel in late 90s, around 1997. It was noticed that people at that time on PCs were running more and more multimedia applications, and multimedia was mostly at that time audio and some video, and that often involves some kind of filtering. And when we are filtering, in media applications, we are operating typically on vectors in one or two dimensions. So the way how this is implemented is essentially there are two source vectors in relatively wide, placed in relatively wide registers, and then on some part of those very relatively wide words, we could apply the same operation and get the result in the destination register. So we would fetch one instruction and do the work on that corresponds to multiple instructions by applying it to this kind of vectorized data. This was called MMX, or multimedia extension, appeared in Intel's Pentium 2 processor. And then later generations were named SSC streaming SIMD extension that appeared in Pentium 3 and Pentium 4 and beyond. And then later on we got AVX, advanced vector extensions. Here is a quick evolution of what has happened there. So it started with MMX around 1997, and remember, all Intel processors have to be backwards compatible. So MMX is still around with us. Every single newer processor is still implementing MMX. But what has been happening, the SIMD width has increased. So the first we went from a 64-bit SIMD to 128-bit SIMD by adding different versions of SSCs. And then with AVX we got to 256-bit SIMD. And finally, the most recent processors have 512-bit SIMD. There is an expectation that'll be relatively soon 1024-bit wide SIMD. So in order to support this, Intel had to add new instructions to their already fairly complex instruction set. So all these instructions have been added one after another one in each generation. At the same time, they also had to add new registers such that they can operate out of these registers, and they get more registers as they also get wider. Now, when you run something like this on AVX, what do we get? Do we get any speed up? Do we get expected speed ups compared to our C code? And the answer is yes. Look at this. Now, if you use AVX extensions on an Intel processor, you will get some speed ups compared to a plain C. The speed ups are around 4x. And no, you're not going to get around cache size limitations if even with AVX. That doesn't help. But the code generally just gets faster. Is this as fast as you can go? Well, you can check on this a few years old Intel processor i7 from a few years ago. Peak performance is 25 gigaflops per second. That's a processor that is running at 3.1 gigahertz with 2 instructions per cycle and capable of doing 4 multiplications per instruction. So we are still at like a quarter of the maximum throughput that we can get through that. But we are getting all nearly theoretically speed up of 4x over a single scalar operation. A few other things about the architecture. So when we look at SSC or MMX added these XMM registers. These are the extended registers. In MMX they were 64-bit wide, in SSC they were 128 bits wide. So they are separate. There is a separate set of registers that exist in the processor. These are not the general purpose registers and not the floating point registers. They are additional vector registers there. So they also can be split. So one can work on a whole 128-bit wide data, or split it into 2 64-bit words or 4 32-bit words, or break it down even further. By the way, MMX often usage model was to take these 64-bit wide words and break them down to 8-bit chunks and work with that generally as integers for audio applications. Generally, you'll hear that Intel implements something that is called the packed SIMD type. What does that mean is that in these 128 bits in SSC and SSC2, we can pack 16 bytes that are 8 bits wide, or we can pack Intel's words, which are 16, but Intel calls 16-bit operand a word, so we can pack 8 of those, or we can pack 4 double words. Double words are 32 bits, or we can pack 2 quad words, and quad words are 64 bits. Single precision floating point takes 32 bits, double precision floating point is 64 bits. Now, it really depends what kind of an Intel processor you have is what you get. Some of these things may appear in laptops, some of them may appear in desktops, some of them may appear in Xeon server class processors. This is showing that different generations will support different kind of vector extensions. So if you have a bit of an older one, you may just have SSC. Then there was an SSC IA64, then that got upgraded with AVX, and then finally we got AVX 512. The registers the number of registers is also growing. Early on there were 8 vector registers, then that increased to 16, now there are 32 of them. So both the width of the registers is growing and the number of registers is growing. So if you have something that is really, really highly parallel, and a typical lingo that is used for that, even in scientific communities, is embarrassingly parallel. So if you're working with a lot of matrices, then this is a great architecture for that. It is great for video processing, image processing, and processing neural nets. So what do we have? Well, we do run our standard command in Linux ls CPU, and then we find out what our processor supports. I got, in order to record this class, I needed to get a little better processor. So I find out that I have a floating point here. Then I have SSC, then SSC2, SSC3, and various AVX extensions. This is useful to know when we try to write assembly code for that, but also this is something that our GCC C compiler generally is able to use. We're going to see a bit of examples of how we use them, these extensions, in the next modules, in the next sections actually. See you after a quick break.